Well, today we're talking to Steve Lowry, who's had a long and distinguished career with the BBC in engineering. And Steve, you actually joined the BBC as a vacation trainee, which I've never heard of a vacation trainee. Tell me what that was.
Well, I was at Southampton University, and I think doing a course in electronic engineering, I knew that I didn't want to do engineering for engineering's sake. And in the second year at university, you had the chance to apply for temporary jobs in somewhere that probably appealed to you. And I was lucky enough to get a vacation training attachment up at BBC Wood Norton at Evesham. And although some of my colleagues did the same kind of thing, they ended up with lesser postings and came back going, God, I don't want to work there. It was dreadful. I was lucky. What I saw at Evesham was totally confirming. It confirmed that I really wanted to work in broadcast engineering because my talent, for good or bad, is the technical side of things. I'm a technocrat, if you like. And I needed some way to get closer to the creative side of things by offering that skill into television, please. I applied for 3 jobs, having done that vacation training session. And it was a quiet time at Evesham as well. Evesham was pouring through engineers at that stage. Lots of people were being recruited. And after a year or so of experience and training at the sharp end, a lot of those were going straight out the door to work for ITV. It's cheaper for ITV to have someone else training people. But when I was there for my summer vacation, it was really, really quiet. This old green bus turns up and takes you to Evesham. Felt a bit like going to Transylvania. And when you get there, there's a whole host of trainers with a bit of time in their hands to let you look around. And that convinced me that my future, if I was allowed, was to work in television. So when I applied for 3 jobs, as I've already said. I applied to the BBC, firstly, to Philips, and to Marconi, who still existed in those days in the broadcast world. And thankfully, the BBC took me. The BBC told me that I'd probably end up working in videotape because they had the biggest number of vacancies. I told them that my preference would have been working for news because I wanted to get as close to all the operational jobs as possible. We all went away, I got my degree, and when I turned up on the first day back at Shepherd's Bush, none of those happened. I was put into studios, and I was by then a studio engineer. If you like, a probationary studio engineer. The first year in the BBC is very much you go off on a course to learn the specifics of television. Up at Evesham again, there I was back at Evesham for the second time, right at the start of that 1977 time. You then get put back into an area which, if you did something wrong, wouldn't be immediately obvious to productions. And that's a long year when you're not doing anything particularly creative. At the end of that year, you return to Evesham and do the part 2 of your what's called a direct entry course. And by then they've decided A, you should go, or B, you should stay. Terrific.
When you were at Evesham, did you? Because I have, as a journalist, I have actually been to Evesham, and it had a very old-fashioned feel to it. Did you feel as though, as a trainee back in '76, that you were being watched in terms of potential employment? Were people sort of marking your card for a possible job in the future?
Yes, I don't think there was anything obvious about what they were looking for in terms of were you suited to one specific area. But certainly, I mean, there were tests, I believe, every Friday. You drove away from those thinking, I hope I passed that. In terms of the challenges there, they were perhaps in terms of content less challenging than they were at university. I mean, all the training you were being given there was specific to television. And some of the stuff I'd studied at university, things like waveguides and GPS, were a lot more technically challenging and difficult. So the BBC side of things at Evesham were a lot of content you needed to know. And because I enjoyed what it was all about, I didn't find it a stretch. I came out with fairly good results then. I said like 95% on the final exam at the end of it all. But yeah, surely somewhere you'd like to think someone was going, he's suited to there, she's suited to that department.
So you had a bit of a blip, didn't you, in 1979, where you joined Texas Instruments. This is the first of 2 blips in your career. So you're obviously enjoying your life at BBC Television Centre. So what tempted you to go into the the commercial world?
Well, yes, I think, I mean, since a long time after that, I was interviewing people straight out of college for jobs, and they all want, I want to direct, I want to be in the front line straight away. I had a bit of that about me in 77, that I wasn't doing enough I felt I could be responsible for. And my friends from university had got more ordinary jobs, if you like, for electronics folks. And the BBC was being a lot more cautious with their intake, including me. And the area I was working in was quite dull, really. And I thought, I want a proper job. And I applied for a job with Texas Instruments as an internal sales engineer. It sounds embarrassing now. It sounded like a proper job where you might get a company car and respect and all the rest of it in no time at all, whereas the BBC's pace was fairly plodding in terms of progressing you on. But about that time, when I was applying for the job, and I was one of 400 who applied and I was the one who got it, so you don't think too much about, is this suited to me, when they say you've been chosen for 400. But before I left, I had the opportunity to spend more time down in the studios, that is, being an engineer on the front line in studios. It was almost too late to not leave by then, but it didn't take long for when I had left to go back to go to Texas Instruments and realise, what am I doing here? This is not the job for me. This is dull. This is just doing engineering for engineering's sake, which for a lot of people was great. But for me, I wanted more than that. And I'd seen what I should be doing. It didn't take me long to contact the BBC and confess that I'd made two mistakes. One was to leave the BBC and two was to join Texas Instruments. And they, bless them, maybe because they were so short of people at that stage, actually phoned me up at Texas Instruments and said, when do you come back? When could you come back? And the answer was very quickly. And by then, because I think they were trying to retain people and put salaries up to avoid people being lost to ITV, having been a bad boy and gone away for several months to a competitor, if you like, for my employment, I was brought back on a better salary. And I was brought back to work into studios, which was just fantastic. Studio 5 was probably my first home.
Okay, so let's paint a picture of TV Centre, because you're actually 2 months older than me. I joined the BBC in '82 and went on a training course in London from Manchester. We were taken to Television Centre and I was just bowled over at what an exciting, vibrant place it was. So just describe for anybody who's not worked in TV Centre, what was it like in 1979?
It was, well, everyone says this perhaps, but it really was still at a peak. It was a factory designed to make television. At that stage, it was 99.9% in-house productions. You had slim production teams who were thoroughly competent in making live or as live television. And Television Centre had 8 purpose-built studios, very analogue, very reliant on engineers to maintain the equipment, because at that stage, television was still breaking new ground. The cameras were still very much things that needed constant lineups. If you didn't line them up twice a day and between major recording sessions, they would just drift off to a point where they wouldn't match anymore, wouldn't look good on real pictures. And so the role of the engineer there in each of these 8 studios was to maintain all the equipment, all of it analog. What does analog mean? Analog means that it will drift. It's a bunch of, if you like, it's a soup of technology which is really keen to run off and do its own thing. And the job of the studio engineer there, in any of those 8 studios at Television Centre, was to, as much as possible, make the technology invisible, or if it raised its head above the parapet and caused a problem, to really sort it out as quickly as possible. So that the production teams, who were paying a fortune, it was the most important day in their calendar to be making programmes in one of the studios, that nothing, as much as possible, could get in their way to make programmes. And in those days, you didn't have digital effects devices. You had 4 cameras usually, feeding into a vision mixer, which was designed in-house in the BBC, with 8 crunchy buttons. 4 of those crunchy buttons would have cameras on them. The others might have a VT, videotape, a telecine on it. And you'd have a human vision mixer, of course, mixes it all at the time almost as live, because you didn't do rollback and mixes even. You just recorded the programme as much as possible in big chunks as it should be transmitted. And of course, in a lot of cases, a lot of the programmes were live. So if you look at TC5, where I started off, we were looking after programmes like Swap Shop with Noel Edmonds. He and I were both younger then. Grandstand, these 2 programmes both being live. And then the rest of the week we might be doing, on a time shift, we might be doing Newsnight And each night, those studios, because they were so precious as a resource and so expensive as a resource, might be turned around from being empty one day to having a set in for a program the next day. And overnight, a new set would be put in replacement of the old set, so that you'd come in the morning and you as an engineer would configure your electronics to meet the requirements of each new program, which could be totally different. And of course, don't forget, it wasn't just Television Centre. We also had Television Theatre. We had Lime Grove. And at one point, we even had the Greenwood Theatre, because the place was busting with requirements for studios. I mean, in those days, productions were told which studio they were going into. They asked for a size of studio. So if you were doing a sitcom, you'd be in a studio suitable for an audience, 4 cameras and a set, of course. But you might be in TC6 one week and TC8 the next week. Something like That's Life might be down at TV Theatre every Sunday. But there was a real joy in making programmes. At the weekend, particularly when you had audience programmes, you'd have 8 programmes buzzing with quality television being made in-house for quality production teams.
You were talking before about how dull you found the commercial world in your first break into the commercial world, but this is pure show business, isn't it?
Yeah.
How did it feel working with some of these programs? Are part of broadcasting legend now, aren't they? How was it to work on them?
Oh, fantastic! If you met up with your friends, they would be able to think of anything. Think of the total things they could describe exciting their job in 2 minutes. They would want to ask me all the programs I've been working on and the behind the scenes. And yet, to be working with people with real talent, real special charisma was just fantastic. I mean, funnily enough, as an engineer, you aren't built as an extrovert. You very much are failing in your own mind. You are failing if you're seen in a production day. But you're still part of the team. You still felt very much part of the One BBC from everybody involved. That's engineers, sparks, scene boys, vision mixers, the operational people on the front end, if you like, cameramen, the rest. You all felt very proud to be part of that organisation making quality television.
What was your favourite programme?
In the early days, my favourite was Swap Shop, because it was just full of fun. It was an early start, but that was great. In terms of my career in the BBC, because I've been there for so long, as an engineer, I have to say that my favourite time was when I was borrowed by production to work on the computer literacy project. It was really rare in those days for an engineer to be borrowed to work with production at all. Occasionally, Tomorrow's World would borrow someone for maybe 6 months. And I'm being rude here, but steal their ideas and then hand them back slightly worn out at the end of it. One day I was working in Studio 5. I think we were trying to make something clever work for Newsnight. And my immediate boss came in looking for a volunteer to work in production and someone who had a BBC Micro. And I kind of wandered off because I didn't have any strong drive at that stage to work with production. And nor did I have a BBC Micro. But he did his speech about what it was all about, and I hadn't been paying attention. And he followed that up with, "How about you, Steve?" And being a good boy, I went, "Yeah, I'll give it a try." And I was found a BBC Micro. And for the next 5 years, these were definitely the best programmes I ever worked on because I was part of the production team. The BBC Computer Literacy Project was all about the BBC Micro, if you like. It was teaching the world, entertaining the world about computers. Because if you think back to 1977, the computer world was run by people with mainframes who wouldn't let you anywhere near them. And about 1979, the first personal computers appeared. And the whole of the UK was ignoring them, wasn't aware of how much personal computing would have an effect on everybody's jobs and lives. And David Allen, bless him, who is still involved with the Pensions Association, but at the time was the series editor, series producer, realised when he saw the first series in the studio for the Computer Literacy Project, that was called the computer programme, not go right. He had the wrong kind of engineer looking after that, and I was brought in to look after all the later series.
Okay, so we're talking about 1983 when you're working on making the most of the micro, and as you rightly say, we computers are in everybody's lives now. They're in cars and in the pockets and mobile phones, but then they were unheard of. So just explain for us what the BBC Micro was.
It was I point you towards the Computer Literacy Project archive. That's an advert. We've created an archive which you look at online, which explains the detail of this project. But at the time, yes, the BBC Micro was something specified as a requirement by the BBC, and a number of outside potential contractors offered their product, including Sinclair, New Brain, lots of companies that we may still remember and quite a few we don't anymore. And David and the technical designs folk within the BBC went out to a number of manufacturers, and the BBC Micro was clearly ahead, not just because it was capable of providing colour, sound, and a good programming language, but also because it had been designed to be able to work almost like a camera into the studio. We could take direct feeds, sound, and more importantly, vision directly into the vision system. And if you're making a TV program, that was key to not losing your audience. Fuzzy pictures that you could hardly see weren't going to keep an audience watching and understanding what you're doing, particularly if you're showing coding on screen. And the BBC Micro had been designed with the intention of it being used in studios because it had been specified and designed in collaboration with BBC Designs Department as well as with Acorn. Now, one of the departments I worked with briefly when I was still an engineer was technical investigations. And that was the department that developed the add-on board that allowed you to get the absolute best pictures out of the BBC Micro. So the BBC Micro was the core of all these programs, teaching people not just how to do Word, because no one invented word processors back then, but how computers worked. We were very brave to put out on what ended up primetime TV something deeply technical. And I suppose my start in that job, my attachment with the teams of Microlive and the rest, were basically to make the computers work on the day in the studio. Of course, that was the prime directive because the first series hadn't gone well. I was brought in from studios because I knew how studios had to run on the day, not 3 days later. And I made sure whatever I could do to make them work on the day beforehand happened. And then towards the end, I ended up writing scripts and directing, producing items as well.
Okay. How common were computers in people's everyday lives then?
At the start, non-existent. You had to be a super nerd to have a basic computer that did not much more than drive a display you might see on an old calculator. By the end of the series, everybody was aware. They were in schools. I mean, the BBC Micro was supported by the government because after a few wake-up calls, the government realised that the UK had to wake up to the threat or the opportunity of computers. And so by the end of the series, the BBC Micro was in every school and in large numbers, and kids were learning how to program. And not just program for programming's sake, but the best of the series was the one where we drove things. I wrote software which drove a complete miniature lift that did everything you'd expect a full-scale lift to work, done in miniature. And I wrote that over a weekend for one item, which we recorded probably in half an hour, and which ended up as maybe a 5-minute item in the programme.
I can just about visualise it. It's like a cream casing, wasn't it, with big black keys? Is that?
Oh, yes, that's right. A really good keyboard, which was a big plus. Proper keys that had real travel on them. And it was a kind of cream-coloured computer that had all the connections around the back where you could monitor temperature, incoming sound from microphones. You could measure stress. You could drive real actuators. You could drive motors. It was more than just a dull computer, which is what we're doing now. Every device we have now in the real world has probably got a little ARM computer, a little inexpensive computer, making it more intelligent than we were ever expecting to have back in the 70s. But now most things have them. You look at your phone. Wow.
And you say there were lots of schools in the UK. So how innovative was the UK at that time? Were we leading other countries in our use of computers?
I think probably because of our weather, more people got involved with computers than they did in America in the early days. I mean, obviously the first people who get attracted to anything technical like a computer is the nerdy techie, or just the techie, or someone with that inclination. And there was always a concern that boys got more involved than girls in computing, perhaps through bias. But I think probably because of the bad weather, a lot more people, and I think largely down to our series, which really did go at prime time. We had something like 3 million people watching episodes of Micro Live and the rest. And because we had presenters who were accessible to everybody, none of them were nerdy on television. They all questioned what they were doing and why we were covering items for the relevance to the normal person. And so I think every home realised the charm of computing as well. So by the end of our series, I think because of the Computer Literacy Project, the UK was more aware than anywhere else in the world and more able to understand because of the series we worked on and transmitted for them to understand what we're on about.
Now you mentioned explaining computers. So now we're used to science being delivered by very good communicators like Brian Cox, who can fill arenas talking about science. So what do you think it was about your programs at that time, Steve, that engaged with the viewers? What was it about them?
We made it fun. I think it, like any program, if you're working on a sitcom, you don't expect a dour production team behind the scenes. And my work on sitcoms certainly proved that. I had some fantastic teams, and that spills across into the content. And although we were coming from a department called Continuing Education, who took a lot of their output very, very seriously, as we did as well, we enjoyed what we were doing. We were a young team, a competent team of directors, assistant producers who enjoyed the content. We had good artists who had the ability to take the fear out of technology. But I think, okay, we have a number of technical programs still on the BBC. Compare with 1983, we have very few programs that actually dare to do the depth of content that we managed back in the 80s. I think we've become more fearful of providing people with real education that educates. Lord Ruth will be very upset. I still keep an eye on the programmes that are being made by the BBC about computing and information and technology. And the majority of the programmes I've added to our archive are from the years that we were making Micro Live for the rest. The number of programmes since, particularly now that the BBC has become, if you like, more driven by money, and BBC Studios, the production arm, has to show measurable results. They go for the soft option. So even a Brian Cox series doesn't necessarily have the detail of content that some people can take in. And in the hands of the right presenter, including Brian Cox, I think nowadays the BBC is being shy of putting across the detail of content which can really inspire people, not just the techies, but everybody. Even if you come away going, I didn't understand all that, but it sounds fantastic. I understand more now than I did. And for computers, to not understand some of the detail of computers nowadays is almost criminal. That's why people get scammed. To me, there's still a need for something that still teaches people the detail. And if you do it right with proper entertainment, it's still valid.
Yeah, were you aware, because as a journalist, I've interviewed many scientists in my past, and sometimes you have to just say, look, I'm really sorry, but I don't understand what you're talking about. Were you aware of that with your audience, or did you think they would get what you were trying to put over?
Yes, very good point. I mean, as an engineer, engineers have the precise, exact answer to why something works, which is 100% true, but might only hit 50% of the audience. Now, when I was writing scripts for items for Micro Live and the rest, we would have a rehearsal day where all of the kit was brought into just an office, and our presenters would look at my script and go, I see what you're saying, Steve, but can I suggest this? And for a while, until both my left and right brains were working, I was really resistant to going away from the perfect explanation, but only to an engineer, the perfect explanation. When Fred or Leslie or Mac or John Cole rewrote what I'd written, that was the version that would reach 95% of the audience, because being professionals, they knew how to sink in a lot more of the understanding, almost without people noticing. There was no turn-off that a techie answer to the question would be providing. It was something which, by their natural presentation and the words they had chosen and fine-tuned, worked. So I don't think we lost many people, really. Okay, 3 million people out of, at the time, 40 million people isn't a lot, but it was pretty good for some of the time slots we went out in, and people enjoyed it because it was fun in the programs as well. And even if you lost people on deeply techie item where you were perhaps showing them how to do a bit of coding. The next item was fun. You were maybe with the RF checking out something that they were using with computers. And there was enough visual and fun content in that to keep the audience throughout the half-hour show.
What about feedback from your audience? Did they challenge you? Did they come back at you and say, have you tried? Have you thought about this? Have you, we've come across this? Was there much interaction between your viewers and you as a team?
Yes, there was. I mean, in those days, we were still part of an educational setup within the BBC. There was a lot of feedback from the educational areas of the BBC, long since gone, and they were in direct contact with colleges and schools to provide any feedback or suggestions. And of course, we were very grateful for suggestions to fill the gaps in a recording order. So yes, we've very much worked both ways on that. I must say it's really rewarding now when you go back to somewhere like Bletchley, to the Museum of Computing. David Allen did a talk there back in, I think, 2013. And a lot of people came up afterwards and said, your program's changed my life. Because before that, I didn't realise what was possible. And because of what you told me and how inspiring it was, my life and my job, the ones I could choose from, opened up and were so much better. You can't ask for better reward than that.
I can hear the passion in your voice of those years for you. But by 1987, you're back in the kind of showbiz world, aren't you? As a technical coordinator working on shows like Top of the Pops, EastEnders, Victoria Wood, Crime Watch. What was your role in those programmes?
Well, the computer literacy project was stopped. The education department decided they ought to do something more serious. They went off and did the education show with the budget that used to be used on Microlive. Fair enough. And there was no longer a need for me. I was briefly an assistant producer, and bless them, they did try and get me up to Open University to be a director up there. But to be honest, I knew that I wasn't a natural director and I needed to find something back where I could work even more closely with, as you say, a whole range of programs, but to still use my technologist background to making programs easy for those range of programs. So luckily a job was advertised for a tech coordinator, which was a different kind of job than being an engineer. The tech coordinator was, if you like, the interface between the technical world and the creative world, therefore ideal for me. And in that role, which I was taken in for, which is great, it had a whole set of different descriptions. I think I was called a tech coordinator, resource coordinator, studio resource manager. The core of the job was always the same. You got in contact with the production teams you were going to be working with, be it on See Here, Top of the Pops, Allo Allo, the Olympics, Grandstand. As soon as you knew you were on the programme, you would talk to them and see what they planned to do on the day. And you would obviously work out which crew they wanted, try and find as many of the crew they would prefer, named names to work on that programme, and also to make sure that anything in terms of cameras, sound, videotape, feeds, extra devices and safety were all taken care of, and there at the start of their most important days, the studio days.
Of course, Top of the Pops is still, from that era, is still regularly on the BBC now, isn't it? And of course, obviously, it looks a little bit dated now, but it also looks very exciting. Was it an exciting, vibrant programme to work on?
Yes, I mean, everyone worked on Top of the Pops. It wasn't one of the programmes I worked on for many episodes, but I think in those days, everybody more or less did everything. And Top of the Pops, yeah, I mean, to have, one day I was walking down the audience area of, I think it was TC6, and there was Phil Collins just sat between rehearsals, and you think, wow, I've this is a megastar. And to be able to be part of that buzz was fantastic. And there was a real buzz, of course, of the night with the audience in, lots of cranes. Another programme that, as much as possible, was shot as live as well. So there's that added buzz of having to get a complex show like that right first time. Although I disappointed some of my allocations team, I was probably happiest working on programmes like sitcoms, which didn't have a lot of technical requirement particularly, but they wanted the right kind of buzz out of their team. And I was lucky enough to work with Mike Stevens, who's one of the first director-producers who realised that working on videotape in the studio, it was an audience show, be it Allo Allo or Brittas Empire, and then to have the insert material shot on film wasn't the right way of doing things, because film, wobbly old film, totally different colorimetry, jarred between its content and the studio content. And Mike was one of the first to say, can I take my studio team, the same team as I used for the recording days with an audience, out on location? And so we went off with OBs used to laugh at it, or sneer at it, a little van called Insert Unit 2, with a 1-inch recorder, which shouldn't have been taken away from the lab, but was brought out into all sorts of locations to record the material at studio quality out on location. And that was just fun. Why not work in something where you're a valued technologist making it all work with your team and with your production team, and also to have fun. So the sitcoms I did quite a lot of the time. But in between times, to earn that reward, I guess the second most, certainly by the end of my time at the BBC, the other programme I worked on a lot was EastEnders. Now, I know a lot of people don't watch EastEnders, and it's not for them, but to work on it, as in a lot of programmes, working on a programme is so different from watching it and the content. And EastEnders was groundbreaking at the time. It started off on a 6-month trial up at Aylesbury, which the BBC had recently acquired from ATV. ATV left no Muppets behind. Everyone who went up for the handover period were really disappointed. But the studios were used by a variety of productions, and particularly in my case, EastEnders. EastEnders started off fairly small. It had one studio, it had transmissions 2 days a week, and just a couple of teams working on that. A planning team who would even have the luxury of a rehearsal on set in the studio for the material they're going to be recording the following week. And I think partly because it was so intense, if you like, conveyor belt television, it was drama like drama wouldn't recognise themselves because of the budgets and because we needed to record a lot of material in a very short time. EastEnders was always shot multi-camera and as much as possible scene by scene live as well. In the early days, we had the same problem in 83 as anywhere else, that the cameras and the kit needed a lot of nurturing to keep them working to a satisfactory standard. And a lot of the day was actually tied up in doing things like lineup, even to a point where you still recorded your material just for part of the day to Television Centre. And Television Centre was a long way away, and occasionally you'd lose all your lines because someone in the high street of Boreham Wood would have dug your lines up. As EastEnders progressed towards my end of the time there, towards my retirement, EastEnders was being recorded locally. Its budgets had been squeezed more, but by then we could record 4 feeds, usually a cut output, and 3 ISOs in the studios. And obviously by then we were also up to a lot more episodes per week. But things had got a lot tighter. I mean, the crew, you almost had to argue for every camera person for every half day of shooting EastEnders. The BBC's had a lot of squeezes, and EastEnders was no exception to that. It always started off with a tight budget, and by the end, a lot of the time we consumed was just trying to save pennies because there wasn't the budget to make EastEnders any other way.
You say it was groundbreaking, and of course it was, but when you look at a programme today like Strictly Come Dancing from the same complex, what do you think about that? The way that technology has changed.
In terms of complexity of programme, yes. I suppose the most complex programme I worked on, not in terms of LE value, was the coverage of the general election. 1992, it's not exactly like for like, of course. Strictly is very much high LE. But 1992, I was one of the 2 resource managers looking after election coverage. And that involves something like 50 OBs, a whole array of kit down on the floor, obviously swingometers, Dimblebees and all the rest. And I worked for 36 hours on that. To me, that was the biggest programme achievable at the time. You look at Strictly, and yes, in terms of entertainment and gloss, moving lights, handheld cameras, lightweight cameras, smoke effects, all the rest, fantastic. I mean, the nearest equivalent, I guess, would be Top of the Pops. But in terms of Top of the Pops, that would have been mostly cameras doing clever crane shots. And cranes were heavy and big back in the Top of the Pops days. They were 2-ton massive bits of kit. And nowadays, cranes are lightweight. You can do Steadicam because the cameras are small enough to be put on a rig where the cameraman can run around, and any motion from his walking is smoothed out by the Steadicam. So yeah, a lot of the kit has got more capable, more lightweight, and therefore you can do a lot more with your program. In the end, you end up with only so much time to do a program, and now the technology is much more capable whilst not breaking down than it was a long time back. I think we've always stretched the boundaries, and as the technology's got more capable and less unreliable, we've been able to do bigger and flashier programs.
Of course, the BBC still thinking about the Green Planet now, where you get the 10 minutes at the end where they're explaining how that was made, technically how a sequence was shot or something. Did you feel in your time on EastEnders, you describe it as groundbreaking, that the BBC really was at some kind of cutting edge over technology?
Well, when I joined, the BBC was very much inventing things that no one else had thought of. I mean, the first standards converter to turn American TV into UK TV standards was designed by our design department. As things got tighter on budget, some of our in-house design had to go. And also the technology got to a point where you could no longer, when you weren't happy with your early camera made by EMI, go to another British manufacturer, say Lynx, and say, this is the spec, can you build something? Because the way cameras are built nowadays are quite different. You need custom chips, and for that, a bit like designing an iPhone, you don't build just 10 of them, you need to build a lot more than that to break even. And so eventually, between EMI in 2017 and Sony nowadays, you need to buy a lot of the kit from manufacturers who are going to sell to the world. So a lot of the innovation was durable and inventable by the BBC in the early days, and it became more difficult for the BBC to come up with some kit cleverness into the 2000s, 2015s. But still, if you look at things like virtual TV, I worked on the Sydney Olympics in 2000, and although studio department had been really reduced by then, we still had some incredibly clever people who did things that nobody quite believed in-house as well as out of house until they happened. The control rooms for the Sydney 2000 Olympics were actually in a converted abattoir warehouse, enormous abattoir warehouses where all the broadcasters were put. So you start with nothing, and this warehouse where all the broadcast kit was installed was a good train ride, a serious train ride away from Sydney and Sydney Harbour Bridge. But because of the cleverness of in-house BBC engineers, particularly Danny Popkin, who was the man who came up with his own design, to the viewers back home watching the programme, our presenters were sitting in a fantastic view of Sydney Harbour Bridge. And as the cameras moved, so did the view match behind. There were live feeds all the way from Sydney Harbour back to our abattoir studio. In terms of scale of production, that was the biggest production I've ever worked on. Sydney 2000 was a joyous Olympics. It was before particularly worries of terrorist attacks that happened later in America on subsequent Olympics. And of course, what better host than the Australians in Sydney for an Olympics like that? And it went, thankfully, really well. I wasn't a natural at sport. I worked on sport. And obviously, before I went to do Sydney Olympics, I was chosen to be one of the few resource managers out there to cover the 24-hour shifts out there. But we made sure before I went out there that I was more or less up to speed of the language of sports production and what was required yesterday and how to do it. And of course, until it's over, I think talking about all this afterwards is lovely because you've already survived it. At the time, every night when you're talking to London, in the days when it would take 3 days to establish any kind of communication between Sydney and the UK, to get programmes out faultlessly for 3 weeks of transmissions, at times on both channels, from a converted abattoir with all the kit built to make the studios work, shipped in, and built by studio engineers who'd come out early to build it. At the time, that was nerve-wracking. And you get to the end and you watch the closing ceremony fireworks and you think, got away with that one as well. It worked. I mean, you are in the hands of the technology. If the technology fails, as a resource manager or as an engineer, hopefully you've anticipated that and you've already come up with the quickest workaround. But if you haven't, because you've been surprised, you still need to keep your calm and still maintain the recording or the transmission as joinlessly as possible. So I guess one of the skills I needed throughout my career was to appear calm throughout, because the last thing a production team on the day wants someone panicking when they're meant to be responsible for everything, people and kit, all the operational side. But as I say, I think I was blessed with good luck that very few of my productions ever had a serious day when things went badly wrong. There was one day when I was looking after a programme called Bodger and Badger, and the power to television centre failed. The emergency lights came on, and the producer said to me, does this mean we can't record? You have to laugh afterwards. Television needs electricity. We didn't have electricity. So what do you do next? You go and find someone who's brave enough to turn the master breaker for the power enough to restore things back to that studio. So we had our moments, but generally, I think mostly people were grateful for what we as an operational team achieved for them.
So after the excitement of the Sydney Olympics, Steve, you then have your second breakout to go back to the commercial world. Why?
I'd have chosen not to, I guess. Leading up to those years, Michael Checkland and then John Burt appeared, and the one BBC was being split into a number of little units. Each had to play shops, as I called it. So all the concentrated effort of just making television efficiently was, in the dream of particularly John Burt, going to be disturbed on a daily basis by discussions about minutiae of costs. So everyone had to invent a marketing department, a sales department, and that, of course, involved more people, which cost a lot more money. And we're invited along to be told to believe this dream in courses like extending choice, which just left me furious. If I'd have been quieter and just left to get on with making television, I might not have left. But when I see an injustice to something as special as the BBC, I couldn't stop myself from expressing my views about what a rough direction the BBC was being led in. And that kind of attitude wasn't allowed at that time in the BBC. And because the number of resource managers was being cut, because part of producer choice was that productions, rather than using the always efficient television centre, could choose to go outside and make their programmes as well. Always an alternative. And of course, outside productions were delighted to lure productions outside for, at least the short term, lesser money. And so there was the need for less resource managers, and therefore redundancies were available. And I was chosen because I guess my managers didn't like me expressing my views about the way the BBC was going. And for the first time in my life, and I think the only time in my life, I happened to have been headhunted about 6 months before this crunch point by the company that makes all the television for Forces TV and radio, BFBS, as most people remember it. It was owned by Kingston Communications, who are the company up in Hull who run a phone and internet business now. And they'd bought BFBS Television, the 3 studios at Gerrards Cross, and they were looking to expand beyond just making television for the forces, but also to use the spare time in one of the 3 studios, or at least 2 of the 3 studios, to make money, because I don't think they really understood the maths of running TV studios. You could have a really good 6 months where a programme was making loads of programmes for 6 months, and then the studio was empty for perhaps 3 months, and they wanted someone to come in for the programmes they were hoping to attract, to make sure it all ran as smoothly as it would do in the BBC, and they chose me to be their operations manager. So when I was told I was no longer needed because I was redundant, I went to BFBS. I guess when that happened, I was back at EastEnders. My other 2 colleagues disagreed with the new approach to the BBC as much as I did, but they had the common sense to just shut up and get on with it, because we knew not many people wanted to work on EastEnders. It was hard work. Every day was mostly in the studio, and you had no escape from that, and there were 12-hour days without escape. And so the people who were happy to work on it, the 3 of us, would have probably carried on doing more or less what we were doing before and after John Burt, if we'd have been more, diplomatic about the changes.
But you did come back, didn't you? You came after a couple of years in the commercial world. You did come back. Why was that?
2 reasons. The BBC, I think, realised the mistake, and Greg Dyke was with us. And I think some of the things the BBC realised they had lost, not all of them, were coming back. And 2, one of those wonderful timing coincidences again, where we hadn't got enough people in to fill the gaps in the schedule at BFBS Television, and therefore that was looking rocky. And at the same time, one of my colleagues at EastEnders, it's claimed, had caused a problem with the press and was therefore no longer welcome to work on EastEnders, which gave the remaining one of the 3 of us, who was still there when I left, still there when I was probably looking for a job again. He heard, because I still ran a lottery syndicate for resource managers, he heard via that grapevine that Steve was maybe looking for a job. And he phoned me up 10 minutes before I was told the final decision that I would no longer have a job at BFBS, to say, would you like to come back and work on EastEnders again? I mean, you can't make those things happen. It was just total good luck. And so I left BFBS on the Friday and I was back on EastEnders on the following Tuesday, initially as a freelancer, and then longer term, when they advertised the right job, back as staff until I finally retired. And as I say, there were still resource managers out there who could work on EastEnders, but they really didn't want to do it. And myself and a few others enjoyed it. I enjoyed the team. I enjoyed the people behind and in front of the camera. And after doing EastEnders from its early days, I think about from its second year of production through to 2015, I had a real bond with it and I really understood it and how to make it work best for everybody, really. And I think that respect for the programme and people's respect back that I knew what I was talking about, always a nice thing to have, was a perfect solution. So yes, I left the BBC twice. Sales job and then BFBS. And each time I came back, I had learnt so much how special the BBC was and actually still is. That wealth of competence, that choice of kit. Somebody with real specialism would probably fix it. And if not, there would be a fix to make the programme still work. You don't get that outside. And to have that level of quality of the people working for the BBC always used to recruit people who deserved something better, but because we all loved working in television so much, the BBC got people who were immensely overqualified for a lot of the jobs they did in production and in operational side of things, and engineering everywhere. And for a lot of the time, they didn't take advantage of that. They just enjoyed the joy of having people who had the competence far beyond the job they might be doing. And we were happy doing that job beyond, if you like, our immediate competence.
You retired in 2015, but you're far from removed from TV, are you? You're still involved with the BBC, you're still working on projects, so that drive and enthusiasm is still there for you.
Yeah, the BBC is in my soul. And my years in the Computer Literacy Project are definitely, if you want to pick up 5 years in my 38 years in the BBC, the best years were the Microlive years, the Computer Literacy Project years. So when David Allen was doing a talk to Bletchley and he contacted me, we've stayed in touch all the way since the 80s, but he contacted me again about his talk and we discussed the idea of immortalising the project. And because I was still competent in writing software, I did a lot of software to make people's bureaucratic lives in the BBC easier by writing stuff for Word and Excel. I'd still kept up my programming side of things. And when he raised the idea of being able to access all the programs we'd made for the Computer Literacy Project as something that initially maybe just the BBC could look at and search, but really anybody could look at and search on the internet, I went away and thought, we could do that if we can find the material. And the short version of the story is that I bumped into someone from BBC Salford who could get access, because David and I both didn't know whether BBC Archive still had the material even. It might have been wiped, because tape was expensive back then. Our programmes may have been lost forever. But someone at BBC Salford said, I'm hoping to do a programme about the history of the BBC project, about computers. And I therefore have access to the BBC Archive. And in return for the odd favour I did for him, which was small in comparison to what he did for us, he found me something like 2/3 of all the programmes which were core to the project. And from that, I developed something which was a great demonstrator to show to people inside and outside the BBC that the idea of a computer literacy project archive was possible, doable and feasible, particularly if I were to put in 3.5 years worth of pro bono work, zero cost work, and it was going to cost the BBC practically nothing. So David and myself both got involved very much with this project. David's forte is to talk to people high and low in the BBC and convince them to lend us their time on projects they're not, in theory, meant to be involved with, but they find the spare time to support what we're doing. And David also stayed in contact with Herman Hauser, who was one of the founders of Acorn Computers and is now one of the founders of ARM Computing, who would provide any cash that we needed to fund the move from my demonstrator to an online version of the archive. The end result is that I'm still working on the archive. We have a published version, which anyone can access. But on top of that, I expanded the brief for the archive to include more or less any programmes, TV and radio that the BBC has ever transmitted that's relevant to the project, i.e. computing. And so I'm still working on it, and I'm still delighted to be working on it because I think it's something special. The whole project was special, and to have an archive where anybody can look up material, and I've now archived it to such a point that you can search for individual keywords. If you just want to look up Clive Sinclair or ARM, you just put in the word, and my software, or the online equivalent of the software, finds exactly what you're interested in. So yeah, that's something I'm proud of, and I'm still happy to be working for the BBC in a way. Haven't been paid a penny, quite happy with that. The BBC gave me so much from 77 to 2015, that, and I enjoy doing it, of course, but I'm quite happy to do this and never think of a penny's payment for this pro bono work I'm still doing on the project.
Steve, that sounds a really good point to leave, and a great project from your time at the BBC. Steve Lowry, thanks very much indeed.